Hey, and welcome back. And in this lesson, we're going to look at camera settings inside of Blender. So first, let's create some objects in our scene. So I'm just going to duplicate this cube. So Shift D, and then I'm going to press Shift Z to move it on the X and Y axes. Maybe just place it there, and maybe one more. So Shift D, Shift Z to move it on the X and Y. Maybe something like that. So we just have a little bit of depth in our scene, and I'm going to delete this light for now. Let's just hide it. Maybe we'll need it when we do a little test render. So to look through your camera, you can see this is our camera in our scene. To look through this camera, you're going to click on this little camera icon right here. So that will jump into your camera view, and the minute that you move your scene around, you're going to see it's going to jump out of that camera view, and then you are in the normal orbit view where you can orbit around your scene. So I'm going to click that again. It's going to go into that view, and then it's going to just move out whenever we move our mouse around. So there's a way that you can actually adjust the camera view while you are looking through it, because obviously you can grab this camera and you can press G on the keyboard and move it around and rotate it around as you will do with a normal object. But that's usually quite difficult to get the exact perspective that you want. It's easier to look through the camera and then kind of move it around where you want it to go. So to do that is we're first going to go and look through the camera. And then you're going to press N on your keyboard, N for November, and then you'll see this transform tab will appear. And then right at the bottom, you'll see item, tool, and view. And if you click on view, you'll see an option that says lock camera to view. Now, if I click this, it will get this border around it. You can see there it will create that dotted line, and this means now I can now move my camera while looking through it. So you can use the normal keys, the middle mouse, hold in control to zoom, and then hold in shift while middle mouse to pan around. So this is just a very easy way to adjust your camera to exactly the way you want it. Maybe we want to have all three cubes in the center like that. And then just remember to untick this lock camera to view, because you don't want to change your camera view maybe, and then you can just press N again to hide that menu. You can also just click on this little button there to bring it up and just slide it back to hide it again. But using N is just so much easier. So now I've set up my camera view and I can pan around to go out of it and don't have to worry about moving it around. You can also go and you can lock your camera if you want to. You can highlight it like this and maybe go to the filter at the top and enable selectable, and then maybe take off the selectable on that camera so you can't accidentally select it. But we're not going to worry too much about that now. I want to be able to select it and look at some of the properties. So let's look through this camera again. So I'm going to click our camera icon to look through the camera. And with that camera selected, you will see the camera icon appear in the side panel. So if I point to that, you will see its object data properties. And then you'll see a type and also focal length and some other options. So first of all, you have perspective. And you can change this to perspective, orthographic, or panoramic. And usually we'll go for perspective unless you are doing some orthographic renders. So if I click on orthographic, you'll see that there's no perspective. So it doesn't go smaller the further it goes away from the camera. And I'm not sure what panoramic is. I've never really used panoramic, but we're going to set this back to perspective, which is kind of the default camera settings. And then your focal length, this is the type of lens that you have on your camera, how far it's zoomed in or zoomed out, or how wide it is, or how narrow your field of view is. So if we decrease this number, you'll see that we can see more in the shot because our field of view will be a lot wider. And this is like a fisheye lens. And then if you increase this, this will actually just tighten that area of view. So I'm going to set this to about 50, and then you can also do Shift X and Shift Y just to kind of shift the camera around. And another thing that we can do here is we can enable safe areas. So if I enable this, you can change, let me just zoom in here slightly, you can see those lines very, very slightly around your camera border. This is if you want to enable this, if you have maybe some text in this view area and you want to make sure that it's inside the safe area of your screen. And you can also go in here under, let me just see, under viewport display. And here you can set things like your composition guides. So if I go in here, you can set up maybe a third. So I'm not sure if you can see that really. It's very, very slight, but you can see it's got these dotted lines going through like that, and also vertically. So that's just an easy way to set up your shot as well, to compose your shot. Or you can maybe add like a center point. So that's just a vertical and horizontal line. So you can see that's the center of your shot. Yeah, so just many things that you can enable here, diagonal lines, etc., to see just some guides that you can set up. And then we also have something like your depth of field. So let's say you want to have your background blurry and only the objects in front in focus. That is when you will enable depth of field. So let me quickly show you how this works. So it's actually very, very cool. So you can enable this just by ticking that box. And then you can either select on which object you want to focus, or you can set the focus distance manually. Now, I usually like to enable, if I go to viewport display and I enable limits, this will show me where my current focus distance is. So I'm going to go out of this camera view just like this, and you can see this little X here. This is this limits that we enabled, and that is currently where the camera is focusing or going to focus. So as you can see, it's not even going to focus on this first cube, so nothing will be in focus really. So it also depends on the aperture that we're going to set for this camera. So I'm going to go back into camera, and then you can see we have our f-stop, which is currently 2.8. So if you know anything about cameras, the lower that number is, the bigger the aperture will be opened, and the more blur you will get to your background or to the foreground, depends on where you are focusing. So I'm going to set this down to something like 0.4. So that's quite small. So that means we're going to get a lot of blur. And then I also want to adjust the focus distance, because currently, as you can see, we don't have anything in focus because that's the focus distance. So I can slide this number around, this focus distance, and you can see that's actually changing where that focus distance is. Or simply you can click on this dropper, focus on object, and you can just say, I want to focus on this cube, and click there, and you can see that that focus distance is automatically going to be updated to that area. Okay, so now if we look through the camera again and we do a quick render, so I'm just going to go to my render settings, and I'm going to change this to cycles, and I'm just going to change the resolution to 50. So under this little icon, output properties, currently my resolution for my render is HD 1920 by 1080, but for temporarily I'm just going to set this down to about 30%, so it just renders a little bit quicker. And make sure your renderer is set to cycles. Let's just go back into our camera just to make sure everything is cool. So before we do a render, I just want to go to my world settings, and I'm just going to change this background, this gray color. I'm just going to set the strength to 0 so we can kind of see what we're doing. And let's just do a quick render. Now we just need to add a light. So I'm going to unhide this light that we have in our scene, and I think it's bright enough. Yes, so now you can see this first cube right here is sharp and in focus, and you can see the cube just behind it is slightly blurry, and you can see the cube in the far at the back is blurry. So I'm just going to zoom in here, and so you can kind of see this better. So you can see as it's rendering, that background box is kind of fuzzy, and this front one is nice and sharp. So I'm just going to go back to normal solid view, and let's go back to camera, and I'm going to increase, I want to increase my blur even more. So a way to do that is to play with the ratio here at the bottom. So I'm going to decrease this ratio to about 0.5, and that's going to give us an even bigger blur. So let's go back to render view, see what happens. now you can see the difference quite clearly. So the front one is in focus, the middle one is kind of out of focus, and then the back one is completely out of focus. So that is how to do depth of field. I'm just going to untick that and go back to our normal solid view. Just zoom out slightly so we can see our camera frame. So another thing that you maybe want to do is you want to add an image inside of your camera onto the sensor basically. So to do that, under your camera options, you can go to background images, and I can tick that box. And then underneath that, I can add an image, and then you can either add an image or a movie clip. So I'm just going to add an image, open, and let's just add a simple, I'm just going to add this wood texture just to show you how to do that. So I'm going to add that, and as you can see, that's going to overlay into my camera. So this is very good if you want to have a reference image maybe of an area, of a room or something, and you want to kind of see that image overlaid on top of your render or on top of your 3D scene. So this is where you will do that. You can change the alpha, so you can increase the alpha or decrease the alpha to make it more transparent. You can also change it if it's in front of your objects. So if I increase the alpha now all the way, it's going to be in front of my objects, or you can change it to behind. And then you can also change stretch, fit, and crop to just change the way that it's going to stretch your image to fit your sensor or not to fit it. And then you can also obviously just also offset your image, and you can also rotate it like that and also scale it like that. So usually this is just for referencing a specific image. You can also flip it there. But yeah, that is where you're going to apply a background image to your camera. So that is everything I am going to cover when it comes to the camera in Blender. Play around with that, play around with the depth of field settings, and see if you can create some nice renders where the background is out of focus and the foreground images are in focus. And I will see you in the next lesson.